Story of my life. Actually, this is the story of my life. I didn't begin to speak until I was 27 months old. There was no baby talk. There were no one-off words like ball or water. When I began to speak, my parents say, I spoke only in complete sentences. When I began to speak, they also say, I would not shut up. I began talking constantly. And when I learned to talk is the same time that I learned to read. By the age of 2.5, I was reciting billboards and cursive. While my father sat and read the Wall Street Journal, I'd stand on the other side and rattle off the headlines to no one in particular. Decades later, at the age of 37, I was diagnosed with Asperger syndrome. It turns out my brain has a tremendous capacity for processing technical data, but it's offset by a significant incapacity for processing social data. As precocious as I was at reading words, I turned out to be much less able to read people. My senses are easily overwhelmed. I have a particular sensitivity, for example, to overhead light. A faulty processor up here means I have to interpret sensory signals unintuitively. I tend to take people's speech at face value. I have trouble interpreting sarcasm or unfriendly intent. I have trouble tracking the antecedents of your pronouns. I have trouble reading faces and recognizing them too. That is, when I can even manage to make eye contact. I'd rather talk with you while riding shotgun. Having to face you could cause me to lose my train of thought. To me, subtext is a foreign language. I may be fluent now, but unlike most of you, I wasn't a native-born speaker of it. There are many different kinds of literacy. When the fifth edition of the DSM, the Bible of Mental Health Professionals, comes out in 2 years, they plan to discontinue Asperger's syndrome as a diagnosis in favor of autism spectrum disorder. This week's news brought a study of 55,000 South Korean school children, finding that 2.5 times more people are on the autism spectrum than anyone thought. Autism seems to be everywhere these days. Maybe that's because autism is everywhere. Consider the word. It literally translates from the Greek as selfness. Selfishness is a survival trait, or we wouldn't be putting the oxygen mask on our own faces before helping other passengers like the flight attendant says. I say we're all on the larger spectrum of selfishness. So-called autistic people are just way on one end, where there's only the self. And like this podium or these lights, even other people are objects. I'm closer to the autistic end then of the selfishness spectrum than most of you, yet people who know me are surprised. You seem so social, Steve. You're a local politician, a local radio personality. How can you make this claim? If you're on the autism spectrum, how can you be presenting like this to us right now? Jeff Nelson asked you your name in his talk. Imagine that you were chosen at random to give the TED Talk after mine right now. Would you be scared? Not prepared? Stage fright, too, is a natural feeling. Now imagine that feeling every time you cross another person's path. Addressing this theater is easier for me than a one-to-one conversation. I know my role here. I was able to rehearse my lines. But on 2 separate occasions last year, I was unable to leave my bedroom all day, not because I was sick, but because I might have to have an unrehearsed interaction with another person, and that day I simply could not muster the mental energy. Every social interaction for me is like being on a stage. Shakespeare famously wrote, "All the world's a stage." That makes most of you natural-born actors. People on the autism spectrum have this rolling, continuous case of stage fright. We want to be part of the world, but we don't naturally know how to act in front of other people. It's overwhelming, and it can be immobilizing. I know something else about being on the extreme end of a spectrum. On a normal height distribution of American adults, I'm at the 4th sigma. Less than 1 in 10,000 people are my height. Not a day goes by that someone doesn't come up to me and remark on it. Strangers ask me questions as though I were a science exhibit. Before I knew what autism was, neurotypical people were making me an object. Despite being socially illiterate, I was forced to become a public figure. If I was going to leave my house at all, I had to train myself to be social, if for no other reason than to redirect attention from this trait I couldn't help. I started by trying to be funny. One night when I was in college at a particularly welcoming dorm, they had an open mic night. So I developed 5 minutes of stand-up, just on questions that I still have to answer frequently, like, how tall are you? I'd like to answer that question. I'd like to answer that question by declaring myself a metric unit. Sears Tower is 218.1 tall, Steve's tall. How about, how tall is your family, Steve? Or, do you play basketball? I get questions like this all the time. Have you always been this tall, Steve? If it didn't happen every day, I wouldn't still know the answers to these questions. Isn't it great being tall? Man, if I were that tall, I'd be playing basketball. Okay, so I got some laughs. But stand-up is the most sophisticated of social tasks, and at the time I was still socially remedial, so I couldn't sustain it. At the same dorm, though, a large group of students were playing theater games every week. I loved watching and occasionally taking part. But they were cliquish and could be downright mean in excluding less talented people, even as the group leaders claimed that everyone was welcome to take part. I remember thinking something about this isn't right. To investigate this other kind of comedy, 20 years ago this month, I went to Chicago to take a class at the Second City. Some of the most famous comic actors of the past 50 years trained there, but the players' workshop of the Second City appeared to be nothing more than a studio with a carpeted riser for a stage and some chairs. How do you behave when you're on stage and you have no script, no director, no lighting cues, no props, no costumes, nothing? What do you do? And this was the first ever formal school of improvisation. What novice wouldn't get stage fright here? But Martin DeMott, our instructor, would give us an exercise, divide us into random groups, and have each of us do it in front of the others. He'd coach us from the side, his goal only to make sure we focused on doing the exercise in question. He never said how good or bad we were. Here he had us do a stage picture in which we each had to make sure that the audience could see us. I happened to have a camera that day, so Martin took an actual picture of us. One of his lessons stood out for me. Say your partner pretends to hand you something and says, "Go paint that wall. Mom will be mad if we don't wash up before dinner." Now let's say that you say, "That's not a paintbrush, that's a fish." When you deny your partner's reality, you take focus off of the group and put it on yourself. Your partner has no idea where you're going and won't know how to react, and you stop the action dead in its tracks. You should always say yes to what your partner makes up, he said. Oh, I asked him, you mean you never say no to your partner? He paused, he smiled at me, and he said, you always say yes to your partner. In teaching me to say yes, he didn't even use the word no. Point taken. There were formulas for improvising that even I could grasp. Our rookie class was invited to attend a graduation program. That day I happened to get seated right next to Josephine Forsberg, the woman who founded the Players Workshop 40 years ago. This is her with their former student Bill Murray, who asked her recently to teach improv to members of the New York Giants. Every once in a while she'd scowl or grunt at the various skits the graduates were putting on. It's not like they weren't funny, but Joe wasn't really amused. You could tell she'd seen more than her share of improvised comedy. Near the end, one skit featured a woman lying in a hospital bed and a man playing a 6-year-old sitting by her bedside. He'd ask all sorts of naive questions. Some were funny, some were poignant, some she couldn't answer. You really felt the confusion and earnestness of that little boy and the dismay of that sick mother torn between the little boy's need for comfort and her own need. Afterwards, Joe said, almost to no one in particular, that had been the best skit of the day. The best skit she saw wasn't about comedy. Second City may be for professional actors seeking to be comedians, but the Players' Workshop was for anyone who wanted to learn how to play. Inspired, I went and bought Viola Spolin's book, The Bible of Improv. She was Joe's teacher and the mother of Paul Sills, the founding director of Second City. Here are the opening words of the first chapter. Everyone can act. Everyone can improvise. Anyone who wishes to can play in the theater and learn to become stage-worthy. We learn through experience and experiencing, and no one teaches anyone anything. This is as true for the infant as it is for the scientist. She wrote that creative experience happens in spontaneity. When we focus solely on this moment, and we have a task to do, we can't intellectualize or be seized by doubt. We can be free to be ourselves. Her theater games were designed to provide the structure and focus to elicit spontaneity. Look again at Shakespeare's reworking of a more ancient trope. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. But no one usually casts those parts. No one directs us. We players make up the play. We have our routines, but most of our lives, we improvise. Viola's focus and Joe's focus and Martin's focus wasn't just comedy. It wasn't just theater. It was to coach us how to thrive on the stage that is all the world. The moment I read that page, the faculty of the Players' Workshop gave me my faculties. When in doubt about what to do next, even if, like me, you're always in doubt, don't fret about acting or taking action. Do what can be done in this moment. That is play. To stay in this moment, you need a focus. If your goal is to be social, then whoever you're with, that focus is not on you or the other person, but the space between you. Focus on playing along. We on the autistic end of the spectrum, chronically insensible, struggle to stay in any moment. We may need your help constantly, perhaps exhaustingly, to focus, to keep being players. But the key to being social stems from this idea. Learning to play along is how I was able to speak before you today. To everyone who's ever played along with me, up to and including you, to everyone who's waited until I figured out how, thank you.